Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I can see a few people starting to come online. It's great that you are here this afternoon. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section where you can pop your questions at any time, and we'll answer as many of those questions as you can at the end. It will be available the whole time, so please feel free to use that. And the session is being recorded, and we will share that with TENS members in the very near future. But I can see the time's just ticked over 4, so I'd like to hand over to Kerry, who will kick us off. Over to you, Kerry.
Ko Kerry Lee, tako ingoa. Thank you, Holly. Welcome, everyone. Today is the very first Wednesday webinar, the very first time that we're going to meet. We're going to have this on a regular monthly basis, so please tell everyone, come along and get into the habit of once a month meeting with colleagues and gaining a little bit more understanding about the sector or a practice or teachers' ideas. We're going to have a range of things. I met Martin about 3 or 4 months ago when I was lucky enough to attend Engineering New Zealand Hui. So once a month we meet with all the technical groups, and Martin was one of the guest speakers, and I just was instantly captivated by what he was talking about, because he was talking about industry and what it is to be competent and team building and all the things that we actually talk about with technology education, and those links and synergy was just fantastic. And so I contacted him, reached out and said, can you please come and talk to our teachers, because this is what technology is all about. This is where the students are heading, and we can hear what's happening in real life in the industry, but also it's so applicable for teachers in New Zealand and for people in leadership. And so I'd really like to welcome you, Martin, and thank you so much for giving up your time for our teachers.
Thanks, Kerry. No problems at all. So, as Kerry said, my name's Martin Pratchett. I'm the Engineering Practice Manager here at Engineering New Zealand. Before I came to work at Engineering New Zealand, I was working as a structural engineer in Lower Hutt and in Wellington. And now what I do is, as the Engineering Practice Manager, I produce guidelines and work to try to, well, essentially raise the competence of engineers inside New Zealand, which makes this presentation fairly applicable. And so one of the things that what we need to do is first of all is to understand what competence is. And you can look at it as a pyramid, essentially. And so our competence on a day-to-day basis can change, and it is the knowledge, the skills and the attributes that we have to be able to fulfill tasks. And the knowledge that we gain in one day, we can apply and use in the next day. So it's the accumulation of ability to your current point, right? What we've got to remember is that our competence can lapse in whatever that we're doing. And that applies across all areas of our life. And so, for example, if I look at myself, I've been working at Engineering New Zealand for just over 3.5 years now, and I would no longer be competent to work as a practicing engineer, right? I would need to be making sure that I've got another engineer making sure that I'm doing the basics properly, because we forget things. They're just the small things that we used to do all day, every day. As another example, back in 2000, I got my commercial pilot's license just in time for the Twin Towers when the aviation industry collapsed, and haven't flown a great deal since then. And so would I still be competent to fly airplanes to the standard that I used to be able to? No, definitely not. I'd like to think that I could still land one if I really had to, but on a day-to-day basis, definitely not. But once we understand what our competencies need to be and where the limits of our competency currently are, then we can work to actively increase our competence. And we can also do the same for other people. So If we are working in a professional setting in an office, then, and we may be a team leader, for example, then we can sit down with a staff member and say, okay, well, let's define the limits of your competence and let's find out what you want to be doing with your career or your knowledge in this set amount of time. And so you can be planning for long-term goals, medium-term goals, and short-term goals. And then once you've done that, then you can say, okay, well, we can start to put structured learning in place to be able to do that. And you can do that with yourself as well, and one of the things that we have, so as an engineer, for example, most people are working, or quite a few people are working to become a chartered professional engineer. So as teachers, that's working to become essentially registration. And the things that you need to understand to become registered are set out, and so you can look out and you can say, okay, well, this is what I need to understand in a few years' time to be competent after I have graduated from university or polytech. And so how do I fill the gaps in that knowledge? And you can start to work from there. So it makes it a lot easier when it's set up from registration. But there's typically 4 different levels of competence. And one of the things that we have is, there's various danger zones. Where we're safest, or where we can be very safe, is the conscious incompetence, right? And so that's the examples that I gave just before, where I said, I know that I am consciously incompetent to fly aeroplanes now. I am also consciously incompetent to be able to work as an engineer unsupervised, right? I know that I can still look at an aeroplane and understand how it works from first principles. I can look at another engineer's work and be able to identify these things. But would I be able to go back and work on that unsupervised? No, I couldn't. Could I fly an aeroplane unsupervised? No, I definitely shouldn't. Unless the pilot had a heart attack and I was your last option. In that case, I'll give it a nudge. And so then we have a couple of different parts of things. And so where you are conscious, where you have conscious and unconscious competence. And so when we first learn a skill and apply a skill and then start teaching the skill to other people, then we gradually move through into conscious competence. Right? And as a good example of that, as I said, I was a structural engineer, and a fair amount of the work that I did was retaining wall design and either integrating that into structures, people's houses, or to retain cliffs and create flat sections, whatever else it may be. In Wellington, it's fairly hilly, and so there is a fair amount of that work around. So you have to be reasonably competent at it. And when I first started work as an engineer, I actually thought that I knew how to design a retaining wall because we had studied that in the various classes that I had done. That was actually quite dangerous. I was unconsciously incompetent. I thought that I knew how to design a retaining wall, but I actually didn't. And it took a while, and it took until I actually went to design the first retaining wall, and then I realized that I was completely incompetent to do so, and then had to work towards becoming consciously competent. After a few years of designing retaining walls, within certain parameters, I was unconsciously competent, right? It was something that I could do day in, day out. I had accumulated sufficient knowledge that I understood the rules of thumb, that you can just look at something and know whether it's right or it's wrong. I could design something very quickly and then just make the computer programs double check my work, essentially. Where we have the dangers are where we are unconsciously incompetent. And so, as I said, that was after I first graduated and came to work as an engineer. In many ways, I was unconsciously incompetent. And it's where we think that we have a certain amount of knowledge, and we do have an overlap. I understood a fair amount of theory behind retaining wall design, for example, but actually there was a large and unknown part of retaining wall design that I wasn't aware existed. and had never been taught to me. So a good example of unconscious competence, and that can be where we start to move within a discipline that we understand reasonably well, and we just start to move outside of that a little bit. And it seems pretty similar, but we can get caught pretty easily. And so one of the really important things to do is to be able to define the limits of our competence. And once we can do that, and we can admit those limits to other people, then we become much more trustworthy, right? Sorry, I'm going to really have to concentrate on reducing my ums. So if we define our bounds of competence, then we define trust. Then we build trust. And a really good example of that is our local GPs. On the whole, in my personal experience, the general practitioners, medical general practitioners that we have inside New Zealand are pretty good. I don't think I've ever had a bad experience. Certainly the GP that I go to at the moment, we've been going to as a family for nearly 20 years, and I have absolute faith that when I go to see him, he knows what he's doing and he understands where his bounds of competence lie. And once he starts to operate outside of those bounds of competence, then he knows what to do, either to refer me onto a specialist or to be able to gain more knowledge himself. And because he is prepared to do so, then that really, it gains my trust. There's a good example of that. A couple of years ago, I snapped my ACL, which is part of your knee, and went to the doctor, said, this is what's happening. He said, see a physio. The physio came back and said, it looks like you've snapped your ACL, and I got referred on to a specialist. My local doctor didn't turn around and say, well, look, I've actually got a scalpel here, and I reckon that I can give that a bit of a go. I've always wanted to be a knee surgeon. And if he had, then he would have instantly lost my trust, because the physio and the doctor knew their bounds of competence and referred me on to someone with that expert knowledge. It continued to reinforce my trust in them. And that's very important. It can be very difficult to admit, particularly in public, where our weaknesses are. But the more that we do it, the stronger that we become, and the easier that it becomes as well. And so how do we go about growing our competence? Well, the first thing that we need to do, as I said, is to define our current state of knowledge, and then to be able to define our future state, our ideal future state of knowledge. And then once you've defined those two, then you can start to say, okay, well, how can I fill in the gap between those two states? And one of the things that we do, my wife is a teacher, and she does this particularly well. She's taught me quite a lot about critical reflection. And once we learn how to critically reflect on the projects that we have undertaken, or that I have undertaken, and potentially the projects that other people have undertaken as well, then we can learn from those experiences. And particularly if we can do that in an ordered manner. And so Kerry's given me, my wife Kerry has given me some resources that I use, and it's, what was the project? What have we learned from it? What do we continue to do? What would we stop doing? And so on. Very, very useful. We can have open and honest conversations with colleagues and superiors. So that once again comes back to having the ability to take on potentially criticism from other people. Being humble is a large part of growing our competency. And certainly, there's people that I know and that I respect inside and outside of my organisation. And if those people tell me things, then I will certainly listen to them and say, okay, well, how can I grow my competency in those areas? Don't forget, nobody has to be an expert at everything. And so you can say to yourself, well, actually, I don't want to learn that. That is outside of the bounds of the scope of what I actually want to learn. When I was working as an engineer, there were things that I wasn't interested in. And so it's like, okay, well, that's fine. I wasn't particularly interested in doing detailed seismic assessments of buildings and all these other things. I knew what I wanted to do. And so I worked towards becoming more and more competent at that. Don't be afraid to pass things on to other people and say, actually, I don't do that, but these other people do. If you can have a competency framework, that is particularly useful, because then it gives you the goal that you can be working towards and making sure that you are retaining the competency in that as well. If we come back to the pilot's license, for example, I know that for me to be, if I wanted to get my commercial pilot's license back again, then there are certain things that I need to be able to do. I would have to go back and sit my law exam. I would need to make sure that I was competent to fly various types of aircraft. I'd need to relearn how to use all the radios and the checks and all of these sorts of things. And there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 22 years since I flew airplanes quite a lot. So, but there is a competency framework there that I can easily put in and learn from and say, okay, well, there's my goal. How do I work towards that? And NASA have actually got a spectacularly good framework for engineers. And let's just see if this, which isn't going to click up onto my screen, so I just won't do that. But I will put that into the chat for later on, if anybody's interested in it. But what it does is it goes through and it identifies the technical skills that people will normally start out as requiring, and then to build upon those skills for becoming a team leader, for example, and then upon that, for like project management and systems leader. And what do you need to be doing? The interesting thing is that, well, one of the things that I found particularly interesting is that it starts to emphasize more and more on the soft skills that we have, and that as engineers, we're famously not particularly good at. There's a little joke that I like to tell, and that you can always tell an outgoing engineer because they'll be looking at your shoes instead of their own when they're talking to you. So what are the needs that we have, right? And so when we're looking at things, a lot of the complaints that we get at Engineering New Zealand are around communication. Things start to go badly when we don't communicate well with others. And from what I understand throughout just about every other discipline, or from every other profession, sorry, it works just about the same way. If you don't communicate well with people, then they lose trust. And once that trust is gone, then they are much more likely to lay a complaint against you. You lose the opportunity to go ahead and try to resolve the issue. And so what sort of soft skills can you put into place? Communication is obviously one, but cultural intelligence. This is something that once again, my wife has been teaching me a lot about. And there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. And so corporate, cultural intelligence, how are you fitting into the organization that you're working within? When I came to Engineering New Zealand, to be perfectly honest with you, it was a hell of a cultural shock for me. And coming from an engineering office to, there's only 3 engineers that work at Engineering New Zealand. I'm one of them. And there were complications. But so you have your cultural intelligence, but also the ethnic and, cultural intelligence as well. So I was talking to a team leader from Tauranga, I think it was, and she was saying that she's an engineer, and she was saying that, when she goes out and deals with people on construction sites, she's South African, she views the things through a certain way, and she had a lot of difficulty at first dealing with some of the the Samoans and the Tongans and the Maoris and so on. She didn't understand the needs of and the cultural needs of the people that she was dealing with, and really complicated her work life. Now she's a lot better at it. But how can we be fostering, creativity? The ability to listen is actually huge. And so when people feel listened to, then that makes a big difference. How do we foster teamwork? How do we encourage that critical thinking, in ourselves and as well as others? Integrity, as I said before, if you have integrity, then it is a huge part of it. And identifying our bounds of competence and admitting to them, and then making sure that we basically just straight up with people can really go a long way. Even if we're wrong, admitting that we're wrong, and if things can only be done a certain way, then just putting that on the table. But we've got other things like goal setting and stress management, conflict resolution. How do you deal with that on multiple levels? So either with your own colleagues or your managers, for example. But if you're an educator in a classroom, how do you deal with conflict within the classroom? Because that can simmer away and so on. And the other thing is memory. It sounds silly, but just being able to remember basic things like people's names, where they've been, what they've done, it's a huge benefit. Something that I, according to my wife, am absolutely terrible at, and she's right. And so with our technical skills, right? So we're looking at the soft skills before that we need to grow, and so what about the technical skills? And so these are specific to your profession and your discipline, right? Within the profession. And so once again, if you can identify a framework that you have if you can use a framework to identify the gaps in your knowledge, that makes life so much easier. And how do you fill those gaps? Well, a lot of people have thought that the professional development really depends on courses, right? But when we get sent away to go on courses, but actually that's incorrect. And so the courses that we go on should really only make up around about 10% of the learning that we do. And I was talking to our CPD, Continuing Professional Development Manager, here just before, and I said to him, look, in my personal opinion, the vast majority of what we do is on the job learning, and then identifying what we have learned through that critical reflection framework, and then saying, okay, what have I learned from there, and how am I going to work within that to improve at my job or in any aspect of my life, really. But mentoring is a huge thing, right? And so in my personal opinion, what we should be doing as engineers is around about 12 months after coming out of university or Polytech, is to be starting to mentor another person. And if we use that example of a retaining wall design again, then I realized that even after I'd been designing retaining walls for about 12 months or so, I didn't really understand it in my mind until I started teaching it to somebody else. And after that, my competence grew a lot. I taught it to another graduate, and then I realized all of the things that they didn't know, and then all of the things that I didn't know, and had to go through and research things. That was really beneficial. And when I have been doing presentations to school children, as an example, about engineering terms, then I found that it really made me think about things to be able to explain complex topics like tectonic plate movement, for example, to a class of 8-year-olds, or why do windows break in earthquakes? And if you can start to explain differential movement and earthquakes and elasticity and flexibility in buildings and so on to a group of 8-year-olds and have them understand it, I personally think that you're doing quite well. So And so once you've got the mentoring, the critical reflection, where you've got reading, of course, YouTube, I use YouTube all the time. It is absolutely fantastic. I personally don't learn well from reading dense pages of text. I really, really struggle with it. But once I can watch something on YouTube and then ideally discuss it with somebody else, it's on a winner. And after that, of course, you've got the courses. And one of the things that we need to do as professionals is to develop our problem-solving ability, right? And to be able to define and have a process there. That is something that I'm working on. That's the topic that I'm working on at the moment. There are very, very few problem-solving processes that are out there. I've been looking for them. And maybe that'll be my next topic. You never know. If Kerry likes this one, she might get me back again. So after that, you've got your critical observation. My wife has once again introduced me to that. It's been really good, and sort of watching other people and learning just what they're doing, and then you can feed back upon it. Is an amazing ability to learn. And so leadership skills, right? So we've gone through from how do we improve ourselves, and then the soft skills and the technical skills and the leadership skills as well. So this is kind of going on to the next phase, and very applicable as teachers, of course, as well as in the classroom, and then growing the confidence of others, which is the next slide coming up. But empathy is one of the biggest things that comes up as in leadership skills. And once again, talking from an engineer's point of view, it's not something that we are good at. God knows, I know that it's something that I'm not good at. And so I actually had to Google what is empathy. And so I'll just read the results now. And basically, it's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. It's not sympathy, right? Sympathy involves understanding the problem from your own perspective, whereas empathy involves putting yourself in the other person's shoes and understanding why they may have these particular feelings. Yes, it is a skill that we can learn, and I've been trying for quite some time. Unfortunately, I do have Asperger's running through my veins, and that makes it extraordinarily hard for me, but I'm still struggling on. Then we have communication, right? So as I said, communication would, so many complaints would be nipped in the bud if there had been effective communication between two parties. But not only that, it can really help with your leadership skills when you're communicating up and down the chain, right? And so it helps your relationships with others. You can understand others, and you can be understood as well. And as I said before, integrity, right? You've got to be someone who can be trusted. So if you're a leader and the person who is working for you knows that they have your back, then it is amazing. One of the things that I have always held up about my previous employer, I always knew that he had my back, and so I always knew that he was never going to drop me in it. And it's the same with my current manager as well. I wouldn't be working for people that I didn't have trust with, and the only way that you can build trust is by your personal integrity. When you're a leader, you've got to make sure that you don't have to be the best technical person in the world, right? I am a better structural engineer than my boss. She is a much better leader than I will ever be. And so what do I have to do to make sure, when you're a leader, you have to make sure that the other people who are working for you can work to their capacity, right? How do you do that? You have to make sure that the resources are available. You have to go to bat for them. You have to say, okay, well, what are the projects that you want to be working on, and how can I help you achieve that? What training do I need to be putting in place? What resources do I need to be making available, and why? it's your job essentially as a leader to upskill people and to provide with them with a resource to do the job. The better that they do, the better that you look. Okay. There was a steel magnate whose name I can't remember, back in the early 20th century in America, and he said that he never did. He made sure when he was hiring people that they were always smarter than he was, right? And the reason for that is that he could then rely on their skills and their technical abilities and give them resources to do the job, and that is why he became tremendously wealthy. Conflict resolution, once again, comes up in there as well, but also project management, so this is where we really start to need to get good project management skills working in, so that you can be identifying what the project is, what needs to be going on, what resources need to be allocated, either people resources or otherwise. And stress management, yourself and other people. How are you going to make sure that the people that are working for you, with you, aren't becoming overly stressed, because that is that can have serious implications. And then, of course, we've got growing the competence of others. And so, as I said before, what you need to do is to define the goals. And so if I was looking at myself as an engineer, then I'd be saying, okay, well, I want to become a chartered professional engineer. If I was looking at a pilot, I'd say, okay, well, I want to be, a commercial pilot, or I just want to get my private pilot's license back again. And you can set your goals towards that. You can set them with an individual, and you can say, well, if you were working to the curriculum, for example, well, that's great. But what if the person who is there wants to go past that, right? So one of the things is that my youngest daughter she was very good at English, and she won awards and so on. And then she moved on to another class, or another school actually, and she's no longer interested in English. And why is that? It's because she wasn't being stretched, right? And so when she was being stretched, she was part of a group. And so, but all of a sudden the teacher started teaching to the curriculum and not to her individual needs. Whereas if they had sat down and said, okay, well, what do you want? What do you want to be able to do? Well, she's really interested in creative writing. She wants to be able to write a novel. She likes these types of books. How can you set up well, let's say by the end of the year, then you'll have written a book with this many chapters and this many words about this story, with character development doing this, and then we can put that in for this award. How does that sound to you? And all of a sudden the excitement is there, and then you can start to say, right, well, let's build the skills that are required to be able to do that. Yeah. And so you can set it by a regulator, but that is the bare minimum that is required. Yeah. And so you can either look at things, achieving the goals that are set by the regulator, and say, well, I have met with 100% compliance, or you can say, well, actually, I've done the minimum standard required, right? So there's two ways that you can look at it. And I always think, well, that's probably the minimum standard required. And if that's acceptable, okay, but I personally like to exceed that. And then, so we can set it by the individual. You can set it in agreement with the team leader or the teacher. And so, but to do that, how do you find your current competence? Or how do you find someone else's current competence? And so there's a few ways that you can do that. You can sit tests. That's their traditional way of doing it. That has its pluses and its minuses, depending on whose theories that you're reading. There's feedback from peers, and that's pretty solid. A really good way of doing things is to be able to look at work to date. And so I know that, and I'm going to take this back to working as an engineer again, when the gap between the first work that I put out and the work that I was putting out 12 months later was huge. 3 years after that, it was light years beyond what that was at that end of that first year. And so my work to date, you could see it just getting better and better and better. right? It was easier to read. My calculations were more succinct. I was getting less, questions from peer reviewers and so on. And so that you can see whereabouts your current competences are. And that enables you to do some sort of self-assessment as well. And then from there, so it's all about growing your competence, right? And so it has to be transparent, and the framework has to be transparent. And because if it's not, then people can lose an incentive and lose their way forwards, whereas if it's, this is what we're going to do, and this is the time frame that we're going to do it within, clear goals. If we look at, what is it, SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and targeted. And so all of those things are transparent. Once again, bring it in through the mentoring. Do some research, get people looking into things. It's a really good way to learn, is to be able to look things up. I remember that one of the ways that I really started to understand a beam column joint was when I had to present something on it to my peers. And so I've got a project around it. It's called strain creep within a beam column joint. Let's not go into that right now, but all of a sudden I understood it. And because it took me hours of research, but it was a really good, interesting project, and hours of CPD there, which really improved my learning. That got me doing that project got me on the phone to experts and to other engineers, more senior engineers than I was, who, as it turned out, didn't really understand what strain creep within the beam column joint was all about either. They just took the numbers that were given to them through the books and so on, and took that as gospel. Practicing activities, we learn by practicing things, and we get better at things by practicing them. Discussing things with our peers, getting people into groups, and then, as I said, presenting the learning to others. And learn, then teach. My children went to Montessori schools, or went to a Montessori school, and my wife trained as a Montessori teacher. And that's one of the things that they do is you straight away you learn something, and then you get a little bit good at it, and then you teach. And then that is exactly the same as what I have found as well. As I said, when I was practicing as an engineer, then learning it myself and then teaching it to someone else once I had started to get it was a really effective way of doing it. And your formal courses, but as I said, that is the bare minimum of what you should be doing, in a very small percentage. And record your development. Now Kerry works as once again, my wife Kerry works as an auditor and audits teachers. And we have found this with our assessment people as well, when people are going through for CPEng, is that people don't record their learnings particularly well. And so that makes it really hard to prove competence and showing that you have been doing it. And then review what you've been learning on a regular basis. You can be doing that with your manager. You can be charting it against yourself on a wall. You can be doing it with your peers and saying, this is what I've been doing. I've been working towards this goal. How am I getting on towards that? And at there, we are being on time, because I have hit question time. Is there anything in there? No. Does this mean I get to go home 15 minutes early?
Has anyone got any questions? If you have, can you just put them on the bottom? You'll see a thing that says Q&A. If you could just put it in the chat, in the Q&A, and then we can ask Martin the question.
Otherwise, I shall take it as a very thorough presentation. How did you find it, Kerry? Did it meet expectations?
Oh, it was great. I just kept making notes and applying it to my teaching, as well as myself, as well as a leader. So it was nice. I found it really useful for all of the levels. So I'm hoping the attendees found the same. I made a whole lot of notes, but I really liked the things you said about understanding competency, the importance that then led to understanding the importance of trust, and admitting the weakness, which I know isn't always easy, but is so important if you're going to build that trust. Then you talked about the importance of critical reflection, which as teachers we know is so important, but often we don't have time to necessarily do it. So then later on when you were talking about recording what you learn, I thought, oh, often we don't have time to stop and think about what we have learned and our growth in what we've been doing. I also, for technology, we know we can't know everything. So it's so important to surround ourselves with people or have confidence to seek out experts. And again, it's really refreshing to see that that's the same thing with industry, and it's the same, and that you mentioned it today. That
something that I forgot to mention, but I probably should have, is that I've been speaking to a number of employers about what they want from graduates, right? And essentially what it comes down to is that when people come out into the workforce, then they can be taught the complex things, right? But what really needs to happen is an incredibly good grasp of the fundamentals. Right. And I was talking to an engineering firm up in Auckland 2 or 3 months ago now. And I said to them, what sort of, who are the best engineers that you find? And they said, actually, it's French engineers when pre-COVID, when they could get them over. And I said, really, why is that? Because, you know, traditionally New Zealand engineers have been pretty good. And they said, New Zealand engineers now, they're getting taught too many complex things, and they're not getting taught the fundamentals as well as they used to, right? And so really what we're doing now is what they felt should be a 5-year degree and still inside a 4-year master's degree, honours degree. And so, but they said what the French do is that they don't teach, you know, the really complex things. They just go over the fundamentals of engineering very well. And once you have grasped that, then you can apply that fundamental knowledge and very quickly learn the more complex things in the roles that you're moving into. Because you don't know when you graduate exactly what you're going to be doing. You know, when I first started training to be an engineer, I wanted to be an environmental engineer. I ended up being a structural engineer, right? As far as I know, there's no plants growing out of my buildings at the moment, but you know, things change. But if we understand the fundamentals of what we're teaching, then we can apply that to any situation that we're moving into. Yeah, there we are. Someone's popped up with a Q&A there.
They have. Do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it out, or you?
Feel free.
Hi, Martin. People can often be uncomfortable with questions of their competency, even from a supportive approach. How would you approach these difficult conversations to ensure a productive and positive outcome?
If I was, it's super hard. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. And I'll give you an example of a conversation that I had fairly recently. And it was an engineer who gave me a call and they said, whereabouts do I find the seismic assessment forms, right? So that I can go through and do seismic assessments. And I said, well, they're on this website. And he said, oh, you know, have they moved or something? I said, well, they've been there for about 5 years. I said, well, when was the last time that you did one? And he said, well, it's been quite some time ago now. And I said, well, they're very complex things. A seismic assessment is an extraordinarily complex thing. And so, you know, knowing that our skills degrade and that there is a high potential for being sued if you get this wrong, then is this something that you really, really, really think that you're competent to be doing and that you want to do? And you know, we kind of discussed it a little bit further, and they agreed that probably they shouldn't be doing it and they should be passing it on to somebody else. I also have the conversations with people, and what we try to do is I say, you know, so how do you know if you're competent in that area? You know, and on the Engineering New Zealand website, Kerry can send you out the link to it if you like, is the competency, the grounds of competency document that I wrote in conjunction with Water New Zealand. And a really good way that it's an ethical dilemma. A lot of the time it's an ethical dilemma, right? And so how do you know if you're competent? And one of the things that I say to people is, look, if you were standing in front of a court or a disciplinary tribunal, two ways of looking at it. First, could you stand there hand on heart and say, I made this decision because of these things and I absolutely think that I was right. Even though it's gone wrong, I absolutely think that I was right, right? And if you were on the other side of that panel, then what would you think of the engineer or the person who was standing there saying these things? Would you think that that was good grounds? You know, and so if it was a competency issue, which normally these ethical issues are about, right, then people sort of mull through these things and can come up with the answer themselves, right? Could I stand there hand on heart and sit there and say, you know, that was okay, and the other engineers would judge it as being a good idea? Yeah, it's typically not. And so that's one of the ways that I approach it, but it's hard, you know, and as I said, empathy and so on isn't one of those. There's one of those things that I'm good at, particularly. I'm sure I've upset people in the past. I know that I've upset people in the past. Does that help? Did that explain it?
Chris, did that explain it for you? I think, yes, it did.
Great. Okay. Look, even, you know, my number is on the screen there, and so is my email. Feel free to give me a call or send me an email if people want to discuss things further. I'm always happy to help.
Excellent. Well, I would really like to thank you, Martin. It's been really engaging on so many different levels. And I really, really respect your honesty, being able to talk about your own feelings and your own background and apply these complex ideas to yourself and your situation really makes it easy for us to understand it. So I really appreciate your honesty, and it certainly made it easy for me to understand. So hopefully everyone can applaud and say thank you very much. And TENS really would like to thank you for giving up your time to help our members understand competency better. So thank you.
No problem at all. And potentially the next one will be problem solving if you've enjoyed this one.
Yeah, look forward to it.
All right. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.